Urban Odyssey, a bicentennial project of the D.C. Community Humanities Council.
Isaac Franck and his quest for community and social justice are presented in this segment of the D.C. Community Humanities Council's Urban Odyssey series.
I believe I also reminded my friend Abe that it was a brilliant young black lawyer, Charles Houston, who in 1946 successfully pursued a lawsuit against restricted housing. And this was an area in which Jews were discriminated against in D.C. We were helped by the black people in their early civil rights efforts. In 1950, the Jewish businessmen who owned Hecht's department store began receiving attention from both blacks and whites committed to desegregating the District of Columbia. I went by and sat down with the officials of Hecht's, but got nowhere. Then Dr. Mary Church Terrell dropped by Hecht's. You know, of course, who Dr. Terrell was, don't you? Oh, good. Many of you do, but so many of you don't. Oy vey, for shame. A quick history lesson here. Dr. Mary Church Terrell was a black woman who lived here 50 years and served on the Board of Education. And in 1940, at the age of 80, wrote A Colored Woman in a White World. Here, I had a feeling I'd need this. I'll read you a quick excerpt. I have stood in front of a restaurant or a cafeteria in the national capital, looking with longing eyes at a special menu of the day at a price I could afford to pay, but have been unable to summon the courage to go in and get what I needed. Being physically weak, I presume, I did not have the grit to run the risk of being recognized and refused. Dr. Terrell was a very light-skinned Negro. Well, let me tell you about Dr. Terrell's grit. 10 years after she wrote this book, when she was in her 90s, she and two other black people and a white man, David Scull, went from restaurant to restaurant throughout the district and were refused service. They decided to take the Thompson restaurant at 14th Street near New York Avenue to court. That was the beginning of the famous Thompson restaurant case. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled in June 1953 that the District Civil Rights Acts of 1872 and 73, which somehow mysteriously were lost, were still on the books. This judgment marked the end to all segregation, at least officially, except in the schools. It was a powerful, symbolic blow against segregation. It meant that no longer could black people be legally insulted. Yes? What's that? You're right. The schools were desegregated 1 year later. In all fairness, many of the old-line Jewish families, those having arrived from Germany in the 1900s, the philanthropists we call them, were quite ready to move forward. A key ingredient to Washington's Jewish community, however, were the thousands upon thousands. I venture to say there were almost 25,000 Jewish liberals, lawyers, and other government workers who'd come to work for President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal during the 30s and the 40s. Many young and talented Jews rejected by law firms and corporations because of anti-Semitism flocked to Washington. Men like Abe Fortas, Henry Morgenthau, Felix Cohen, Isidore Lubin, and David Lilienthal. Many young black liberals came to Washington to work for the New Deal, and President Roosevelt set up an all-black cabinet to help advise him on racial matters. This included Mary McLeod Bethune, Dr. Ralph Bunche, and Dr. Robert Weaver. The young Jews who'd come to work for the Roosevelt administration wrote much of the new liberal legislation and lobbied for it. Washington had seen Jews come in fairly large numbers at several historical points. Just after the Civil War, as the city and the federal government began to grow, they came to set up businesses to serve the growing population or to work for the government. Many were impoverished Southerners, and some were soldiers who had been stationed here. In the early 1900s, there was massive immigration of Eastern and Central European Jews who first settled in industrial cities to work in factories. But many migrated southward from New York and Baltimore to Washington to become small shopkeepers and tradesmen. Most lived in the southwest section, which then reminded people of a small European village. The old-line German Jews who'd come first and lived mostly in Georgetown helped these newcomers out. Together, they built the first settlement house, the Barney Neighborhood House, and the first playground in the city. These newcomers were also building Jewish enclaves along the commercial sections of 7th Street Northwest and 8th Street. Later, many would move northward into the Shepherd Park section of 16th Street. And many would, of course, begin moving rapidly out into the suburbs after World War II. Then, after urban renewal of the 60s, they came back into Southwest, where they built the only synagogue in the country to share space with a Protestant church. Then there were the New Dealers I'd mentioned earlier who'd come to work during the Roosevelt administration during the 30s and the 40s. Well, to be quite frank, to ask a Jew to talk about the 250-year history of Jews in D.C. in 20 minutes is like asking a Jew to talk with his hands in his pocket. Impossible. Go out and study. Ask the old-timers. They know. They know.